Hi everyone. Today I am excited to welcome Aubrey Aust to the podcast. Aubrey is a writer, researcher, and master's candidate at New York University studying relational psychology and philosophy. Her work explores relational intelligence, the embodied and cognitive capacity to navigate intimacy, conflict, and vulnerability in ways that promote mutual safety and growth. Her work integrates attachment theory, somatic psychology, and queer and relational philosophy to explore how our sense of self is shaped and reshaped through relationships across the lifespan. She's particularly interested in the conditions that promote relational safety, how environments rooted in presence, co-regulation, and mutual recognition support the emergence of a more expansive, adaptive self. Aubrey draws on polyvagal theory, dialogical philosophy, and queer theory to examine how experiences of being seen, heard, and valued influence our attachment patterns. Through her research, teaching, and public writing, she works to make psychological insight feel human and liberatory. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. Today, I am welcoming Aubrey Aust to the podcast. Aubrey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are very welcome. I'm super excited about the number of different topics that we're going to dive into today. But you know, and my listeners know that I always love to start the podcast by asking the same question, because we know attachment is something that typically happens early in life, and it impacts us all through the lifespan. And so, tell us a little bit about your story. Was there anything that happened early on in your life or in your career that led you down the path, and maybe into the research that you're currently doing? Just share a little bit about your story with us.
Sure. So, personally, I would say I have always been quite attuned to relational dynamics. I think a lot of people who end up in attachment and relational work often start off as highly attuned children, sometimes children who are trying to make sense of their environment. So, I personally was most definitely an observer. I grew up in a pretty conservative environment in a smaller town in Midwestern America, which really helped bring out my creativity. Play was central to my life. So, I was constantly creating these worlds in my head where I could be or what I could be. And that definitely translated to how I went about relationships and how I currently view relationships. So those experiences were foundational. And I've also experienced how my attachment patterns have shifted over time as a result of my relational ecosystems, which I know we will likely get more into today, but that's central to the work that I'm doing now. And then academically, my formal background actually began in political theory. I'm trained in Arendtian political theory, Hannah Arendt's work in the ways of being in the world. And I was absolutely fascinated by how societal structures and community, we're talking both on a large scale and intimately, shape our emotional lives and ultimately influence how we're able to experience connection and how we can move through the world, because there's largely a political aspect to that. So it facilitated quite a natural transition into my present work. My move into relational psychology was really driven by this realization that safety, trust, connection, they are all built, broken, and rebuilt in relationship. And I'm fascinated by learning and expanding upon those factors that enable us to feel safe, both physically and psychologically, and learning what those tools are that we can integrate into our day to day to improve all sorts of relationships in our lives.
So tell us a little bit, share with our listeners just a little bit about the current research that you're doing, and then we'll kind of backtrack a little bit and dig a little bit deeper into some of those concepts that you've just brought up.
Sure. So currently, I'm a master's candidate at NYU studying relational psychology and the philosophy of human connection. So my current research focuses on how we build and rebuild relational safety, particularly in the context of attachment, rupture, and repair. So right now, I'm blending attachment theory, the ethics of care, and concepts like affect regulation with more philosophical inquiries around longing, trust, and the desire to be seen. This all really comes down to social baseline theory that tells us we're naturally, fundamentally social beings. Our default state is to regulate emotions and actions in the presence of others. So I'm really interested in these ways that we are co creating safety in our relationships, not just emotionally, but also somatically. What's that physical component to that? How do our nervous systems communicate? And how can we ultimately become better attuned to ourselves and the people we love? And my goal is to bridge theory and lived experience. I want to make space for deeper conversations about what it means to relate with care and make sure that we all have the tools to do so.
Hmm. I really, what really strikes me about what you're talking about, the things that makes my ear perk up, and you mentioned it before, but this like relational ecosystem and
Mhm.
how our nervous systems talk to each other. Having done a lot of work in the early childhood field, like, and having just had a baby of my own,
Mhm.
you know, it's it's right there in my daily life of how my nervous system is maybe projecting onto hers,
Yeah.
and vice versa, that definitely happens. Um, tell our listeners a little bit more about what you mean by this ecosystem.
Right. So we are based entirely on our ecosystems of connection. They can affect our attachment patterns. Of course, the early childhood experience has a significant influence on how we experience attachment over time. But something that in popular psychology gets thrown around, it's not a chronic life diagnosis based exclusively on those early childhood experiences. It's something that can adapt based on those relational ecosystems that we are creating. And so, what does that look like in practice? It means when we are building those relational ecosystems, thinking about the people that we're connecting with, we need to figure out what the elements of safety required so that way we're able to thrive within that relational ecosystem. So, for safety to thrive, I generally break it down into 5 principles. We need consistency. This is a predictable emotional response that's not chaotic or dismissive of others. We need mutual regulation. This is the ability to co regulate through tone, through presence, through pacing, instead of relying on self soothing. So, even just right now in our conversation, you are helping me feel safe because I feel as though you are responding to what I'm saying. And this is an open dialogue. And you have made me feel very calm and comfortable in this conversation. So, thank you. So, we are mutually regulating each other in this moment. There's also repair mechanisms. This is the presence of authentic, non defensive repair after rupture. Rupture is inevitable, right? We're not trying to eliminate conflict. That's not possible. We are human. But what are those tools that we can use to get back into this state? And then respect for boundaries. You see the other not as an extension of yourself, but a sovereign being. And then finally, shared attentiveness. It's when we're able to tune into those shifts in emotion or in body language before they escalate into disconnection. So paying attention to those shifts in tones, shifts in body language, when there's that feeling that you're processing somatically that sometimes happens before we are even able to logically parse out our emotions. What does that mean? And when we're able to see that these are present, the body relaxes and relational safety becomes the soil to continue with this relational ecosystem metaphor. And it allows us to create a space where we have intimacy, where we have play, and where exploration are able to grow.
So you've got me thinking about, so I'm thinking about this ecosystem, and I'm thinking, I'm wondering, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm wondering though, in order for a person to either create or help to create relational safety, um, or accept relational safety, first of all, they need to work on their own, maybe their roots, if we want to
Right.
go with this ecosystem like approach and metaphor, that they need to work on their own roots first. Because what I'm thinking about is, we know that many folks with an adaptive attachment style will seek out a relational partner, whether that be an intimate partner or a colleague,
Mm-hmm.
who validates what they believe in their internal working model.
Right.
And so, sometimes even people with the best intentions, a therapist or a spouse, for example, or even I think about a foster parent or an
Mm-hmm.
adoptive parent, may struggle because they're trying to create this relational safety, but within the person themselves are barriers that need to be worked through first.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that brings up such a great point of how easy it is to either ignore individual needs or even jump into the territory of over repair and
Mm-hmm.
bypassing real conflict, good conflict by rushing to resolution, right? Because premature repair can function just as much as a form of conflict avoidance, where that anxiety about disconnection becomes so intolerable that we just rush to smooth things over. And in that, we're never really addressing that underlying emotional rupture or the personal stuff that we need to work on our own. So,
Mm-hmm.
healthy repair, it is so important that we acknowledge the impact, we learn to sit with the discomfort, sometimes, oftentimes on our own. And ultimately, when it is the appropriate time for that repair, it's allowing the injured party to lead the pace of reconnection. And so tuning into that, if we completely bypass those, we risk layering false safety on top of unresolved pain, which, like you said, you might have the best intentions in a
Mm-hmm.
connection, but in doing so in the long run, that is only going to erode trust rather than help restore it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot about our families that we support in our organization and, you know, or even, I mean, anyone in a helping profession, and I'm guilty of this. I jump into fix it mode. I
Me
want to
too.
help, I want to solve the
Yep.
problem. And I really love your point about allowing the injured person to guide and lead the pace at which the repair happens. And I think that that's very hard for a lot of adults to do, whether it be another adult or I think even harder when it's a child or young person, because you're almost like, well, if we could just get to this point, then things would be okay again. And actually, that's not allowing that person the time, the space, and the room to be able to share their feelings, share their thoughts, process, to get to a place where you can, as you say, truly have a moment of repair rather than applying this kind of false safety.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard. Many people can't or struggle to sit we call it sitting in the yuck. So,
Yeah,
just sitting in that moment of discomfort.
absolutely.
I want to ask you, do you feel that if you had maybe had some more of those experiences of somebody sitting in that discomfort with you during some of your earlier life experiences, that it would have felt different for you?
Oh, 100%. Learning earned security in adulthood was huge for me because I'm an only child. Parents were very attentive of needs. And going into early adulthood, I had a lot of personal relationships and experiences in which a lot of those bonds that originally I felt incredibly secure and safe in shifted for me. And that was very much a period of time in which I had to realize that security must continuously be earned. And what does it look like when some of those traumas experienced in adulthood, whether it be betrayal or loss, or even you can have cases of abuse, can either reactivate early attachment wounds or create new fractures. And so to get through those, it requires consistent, attuned relational safety over time. And that's when we are adapting to our new environments and figuring out how, going back to that relational ecosystem, we can have the ability to heal those attachment wounds into adulthood and shift closer to secure. But that is not a one and done process. That is something that we are all continuously going through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it's such a in-depth process
Right.
too. There's so many layers to it. Quite a few of more recent guests have brought up, the South and all the different parts of the South, and healing that attachment wound. You have to look at all of those different parts of you that have been impacted by it, and it's
Yes.
not just one piece of you. There's so many layers to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about this a lot. I do a lot of overlap with queer theory as well, and how queer theory or, non-traditional structures come into the conversation regarding attachment and what does that mean. And I find queer theory to be a really beautiful reminder that attachment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's
Mhm.
constantly within these cultural narratives about which kind of connections are deemed legitimate or which ones are able to be visible, which ones are societally safe. And so, for queer individuals or anyone in maybe a non traditional relationship structure that need to be seen and heard and valued, often exists alongside these relational scripts that have historically denied that visibility. And so, these attachment injuries, they're not just personal, they're societal too. And so when we incorporate that concept of queer theory, it pushes us to think beyond these normative models of connection and brings in that aspect of play. It invites us to imagine what it looks like to have more expansive or responsive or chosen forms of attachment. And these might be ones that honor the body, the self, as you just talked about, and the complexity of human desire. And so within those structures, layers of rupture can carry additional layers of fear because those relationships often do sit outside of those social scripts. And like you said, it brings in the self, the I. Like, if I lose this connection, where do I belong? And that's a
Mhm.
very tough question to sit with. And that's something that requires a great deal of individual work. So repair becomes crucial, not just for the relationship itself, but also for one's broader sense of legitimacy, of community, and chosen belonging at the end of the day that queer relationality often represents. So this is an aspect where relational safety is not strictly personal, it's also largely political.
Mhm. I want to dig a little bit deeper into your terminology of chosen attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I love that because I think that, or I feel that many adults may have this kind of potential misunderstanding that I'm an adult now and it happened when I was a child and therefore I can't change anything. Like you said, but the idea of having room for chosen attachment
Mm-hmm.
figures or chosen attachment relationships, to me that brings about a huge sense of hope for people who maybe had significant disruptions in their attachment relationships in the beginning of their life, and the power to be able to say, because I think that's I've talked before in other podcast episodes about you know not not having a choice or power in the relationships that you grew up in, but
Mm-hmm.
now as an adult you can choose.
Right.
But feeling tied still to that early caregiver, whether it's a parent or another figure, and having this kind of guilt that surrounds that relationship. And when I hear you say, a chosen attachment, to me that feels like, oh, there's I have choice. There's
Mm-hmm.
room for me in this.
Right. Agency is beautiful. And I love that language as well because we're well aware we are living in a culture that often idealizes hyper independence and emotional self sufficiency, which
Mm-hmm.
sometimes can make healthy dependence feel shameful. And so the fact that we are entering that aspect of choice into the conversation, acknowledging it, it can help teach us that, as we learn over and over again through attachment theory, secure relationships are built on interdependence. And you have a choice in whom you form those with in adulthood. And
Mm-hmm.
so it helps you strengthen that knowledge that turning to others is not a weakness, it can be a resource. And part of relational healing is reclaiming that idea through the concept of choice, but also understanding that asking for care, for support, for closeness, this is not a regression. It's something that's deeply human and still involves a beautiful concept of agency to it.
Mm-hmm.
And what gives me hope being in the field of studying attachment now is this growing recognition that healing is not an individual pursuit. There is 100% an individual component to it. And we all need to do that self work, but it's also a societal project, it's a cultural project, and it is a relational project. And so the fact that we are moving beyond this idea that regulation and resilience are purely self managed, and there is this increasing awareness that co regulation, community repair, and relational attunement are essential to the individual and collective well being. I'm truly inspired by the sense of awareness of both the individual and the community that is arising in modern attachment work. And so it's my both my hope and my belief that by recentering care, mutual responsiveness, and emotional literacy, we're not just helping individuals heal, but we are slowly but surely reshaping the relational fabric of our world. And that is a cause I'm willing to get behind.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. Tell me and the listeners, we talked a little bit about this before we jumped on here, but you mentioned the word care as you were
Mm-hmm.
just talking, and we were talking about ethics of care. Tell our listeners just a little bit about your thoughts about ethics of care, and maybe we'll dive into this caring for versus caring about concept.
Absolutely. So, a large deal of my work is centered on Carol Gilligan's ethics of care. And it's really a framework on how we center responsiveness. This challenges the dominant kind of rule based moral systems that a lot of us have grown up with, and really focusing on asking, what does this person need from me right now? So, in the context of attachment, this means that we aren't measuring secure relationships by whether needs are met in a universal way. It's dismantling that idea and instead asking, are we paying attention? Are we adapting to each other with care? And it also means tending to our own needs. How am I able to show up for this person without sacrificing myself? That's the ethical part of
Mhm.
the ethics of care. And it's something that's so important to also keep in mind. And so it reframes rupture and repair as ethical practices, which I love. I love the idea of care as a continual practice. It's not about being good or right, but it is about accountability to this emotional ecosystem that we are all co creating. And through this lens, without the moral binaries, it allows for so much more nuance because it values attunement over adherence. And that's what makes people feel safe. It's not about perfection. It's never going to be about perfection. If you find me someone who is perfect, I would love to meet them because it's about care that's felt and acted upon. And it leaves space for error, but it leaves hope in the reconciliation and the healing.
It makes me think about Buber and I it and I thou, and how we often fall into the I it and the just the you use the word adherence, the
Yeah.
following of rules, and we have to do this. I think about working in a therapy setting, and I would always get hung up on, the paperwork aspect and
Mm-hmm.
having to do this assessment when we bring somebody in. And ultimately, what I ended up doing was kind of just putting the assessment aside and saying, tell me your story.
Yeah.
Like, let me hear from you in your words. And, in I could pull from that everything that I needed to do the
Mm-hmm.
paperwork, but I was more present, more attuned,
Yeah.
more in the moment, and able then to create those beginnings of that relational safety because I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't so focused on the to do stuff and more about actually caring about why you walked through the door
Right.
today, why you're here.
Yeah, I was just at the Esther Perel conference this past weekend, and we spent a lot of time talking about I, it, I, thou. I love Buber's framework. It's central to everything I do. I would go so far as to say it's like a spiritual component to me, which it definitely was to him. He believed that the I, thou relationship was as close as you are going to get to divine interaction. That's how you interact with God, is when you see the other through that I, thou lens. And for those who aren't familiar with it, the I it conceptualization is characterizing someone as my coworker, my partner, the barista. What is their function in my life and what is expected through that relationship? I thou is a space of pure presence. It's when it is simply what arises with that person in the moment, where we meet the other not as an object to manage or control or fulfill a role, but as a whole sacred presence. And so, in attachment terms, we might say, this is what a secure attachment feels like.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Isn't that attachment in
Isn't
its
that
purest
attachment?
form?
Yeah, I
Right?
don't just see your behavior, I sense your being. I
Mhm.
stay in relationship with your emotional reality, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unfamiliar. And that's when relational safety thrives. And so
Mhm.
that kind of presence is regulating. And I love that base in philosophy has evolved into what we see attachment theory today.
Mm. Well, and just to go back to your comments about rupture and repair, is that again, we're not saying that it has to be perfect.
Right.
Um, as a fairly new mother, there are moments where it feels like, oh my goodness, I just need to get this behavior to stop, or I need
Right.
to make this happen. And you move away from that I thou stance, and it becomes more chore like, and I'm just doing it to check a box, or to make something happen or a change happen. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not about being perfect, but it's about just being more intentional and moving towards that. And if you know specifically that somebody has had experiences of relational unsafety, then we want to make certain that we're being even more intentional about that ecosystem that we're creating with that person in our interactions.
Absolutely. It's earned security. And it's a
Mhm.
practice literally that comes down to just showing up at the end of the day.
um, is there let's talk a little bit more, dive a bit deeper into how our nervous systems talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so expanding on this ecosystem concept and metaphor, like what, in your perspective, in your mind, what ways do our nervous systems communicate?
Absolutely. So I do a lot with somatic psychology and how this informs how we understand attachment. So somatic psychology tells us that attachment is not just a cognitive framework. It's a felt embodied experience. And so our nervous system remembers what it's like to be held, to be ignored, to be punished, and to be met with care. And sometimes we cannot even put that experience into words, but the body remembers it.
Mhm.
So, for example, someone with, let's say, a disorganized attachment style may intellectually know that their partner is safe, but their body might still brace during intimacy. So, somatic work brings attention to those patterns. It's looking at breath, posture, voice, tension, touch, and it gives us new tools to build neural and relational pathways. And it's important to note this is not about overriding the past. It's about acknowledging the past, our patterns, our experiences, what continually comes up for us, and giving the body new evidence that connection can be safe. It can be reciprocal and it can be regulated. So, in creating those new patterns, we're able to create new connections neurologically that wire us for safer connection.
So, I know for many of the folks who are clinicians listening that this is probably something that's not new to them. But when I
Mhm.
think about how we support our parents, our caregivers, maybe even teachers or school staff, particularly with children, um, I mean, I think a lot more clinicians would be working directly with adults. But when I think about those folks who are working with children,
Mhm.
what I want them to hear, first of all, from what you've said, is that this is this is within the child's body, the young
Right.
person's body, and that this isn't really a choice. This is a memory that their body and their somatic system is holding on to. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. And
And
just how
so,
that shows up in how that child is present in the
mhm,
room. And even if the child is quiet, not expressing any anxiety, fear, you don't hear something coming up, but you know. When you pay attention to body language, it's something that our nervous systems sense and we can feel between one another, even if it's not spoken. And in those moments, sometimes words don't do the trick. You don't even need words. Take a space to slow down, just to sit, to breathe, maybe engage in a mindfulness exercise that's able to engage the children in the room and see what comes up for them physically, because that can tell a story sometimes more than all the words in the world can. And
Mhm.
I think it's, and I'm so guilty of this too, we move. It's such a fast pace. And we are in a world that prioritizes productivity and moving on to the next. And oh, great, what's this healing technique? So I can check it off and move on with my life, right?
Right.
Now we're doing the work of unlearning and what it means to sit there with our experiences and understand what's coming up on a physiological level and what that means for us and how we are processing trauma and these conversations on attachment moving forward. But the body has so much data for us. We just need to sit there with it.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that we don't necessarily have to have the solution right then and there. We don't have to just, hey, let's wrap this up and move on. We can just kind of say, "Whew, this is really hard right
Yeah,
now," or it seems like there's a lot going on for you right now,
right.
and let that be it. Like sit with that and
Mm-hmm.
take a few deep breaths, and don't feel like you have to. Okay, what can I do to fix this for you?
Right. We don't have to be fixers all the time. I just did a deep dive on grief and what grief needs to be fully felt. That step one, it needs to be fully felt. And oftentimes that just means seeing and witnessing it in its wholeness. That someone needs to be acknowledged completely for their lived experiences. There's no rushing through that. There cannot be and there should not be. And
Mhm.
for someone to feel fully seen and held by the other, there are no magic words. There is no specific timeline. It is literally just sitting with them and acknowledging that process. And I think we can apply that to so many emotional discoveries or things that we are going through. And oftentimes that's just in how we feel within our bodies.
Well, and I'm so glad that you brought grief up because there's a huge amount of grief involved in healing from attachment wounds. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the loss of what you thought a relationship was
Right.
supposed to be, going to be, um, grief around parts of yourself that
Mm-hmm.
you maybe let go of or you need to let go of, you did let go of, but you want to actually regain those parts of yourself, acceptance around just what happened.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, absolutely. Grief is an attachment event in itself.
mhm,
It's,
mhm,
our nervous system has organized either around the presence of another or the idea, and it can be an idea of an outcome or anything that you have your heart or your mind set on. It's an expectation. And the nervous system has to reorganize in the absence of that, regardless of what it is. So, loss can reactivate early attachment wounds or create entirely new vulnerabilities, but it can also open us up to profound relational growth. So, grieving in a healthy way requires relational safety too. It's spaces where we can express not just sadness, but longing, anger, even love for what was and may no longer be. And so grief by no means is the failure of attachment. It's really a continuation of attachment through memory, meaning, ritual, and is an attachment event in its own right.
mm. I have to sit with that for a second because that's
A
really
lot.
deep.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your insight and your thoughts on that. I wanted to touch a little bit on, you mentioned earlier about about your own attachment experiences and
Mm,
relational experiences. And something that you said, I think needs to be repeated. And you mentioned that you grew up in a physically safe household
mhm.
relationships. You had your physical needs taken care of. And I think that that is a huge misconception for so many outside of the clinical world, is that well, this child maybe came from physical safety. They had a roof over their head. There was food on
Right.
the table. They went to school. But the emotional responsiveness and the emotional connection and the relational safety, to use your words, was not present.
Right.
And so I tell me a little bit just about your journey of understanding that.
Mhm.
Like, you said you felt you grew up in a pretty good place. So
Right.
yeah, just tell us a bit about your journey of understanding deeper that there were pieces missing, perhaps.
Absolutely. Growing up, I would say I was in both a physically and emotionally safe environment. I felt very cared for, very loved. My needs were met. And then going into my life in early adulthood, due to I moved to the West Coast, I was placed in a very different environment of my choosing. I definitely wanted to experience something a little bit different than that which I had grown up in. And that brought a lot to the surface of differences between myself and my immediate family. And with that, I realized that emotional safety that was absolutely built on proximity, lived experience, and me truly living life in the bubble in which I grew up with, which nothing wrong with, but it presented me with an environment in which I really didn't have to burst out of the bubble much. And
Mm-hmm.
so when my environment changed and when I was able to place myself in a location that was a little bit more serving to my needs and what I was looking for relationally, that caused some pretty significant fractures between myself and immediate family. And so that became a journey of me realizing, first of all, dealing with the discrepancy of I grew up in such a safe environment. How can this be happening? To also reforming a sense of self. I would say I almost had to go through a period of grief of recalibrating this person I was and this person I'm becoming. I don't think there's that much of this discrepancy there. I feel like I'm more fully myself now than ever. However, the people who I love dearly and who have raised me don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I really wrestled with in my early adulthood and absolutely formed my early adult relationships in which I felt like I really had to cling to them in that secure attachment style that I, was working on, building on. Oh, now I'm suddenly getting anxious because
Mm-hmm.
these relationships are so central to my identity, my sense of being, who I want to be, who I'm becoming. And so I started noticing those patterns regularly coming up within myself and realized I had a lot of work to do on figuring out who I am as an individual outside of these relationships and ultimately figuring out the boundaries that I need with the people that I love so I can stay in connection with those people that I love. Because
Mm-hmm.
boundaries are not meant to completely sever a connection unless that's what you're going for. It's so you can keep the people you love in your life in a way that's healthy for all of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that period of navigating that dance and ultimately coming to terms with a lot of my ideas on what relational safety is and can be was incredibly informative and ultimately led me to the work I'm doing today.
I really like your statement about boundaries are not, meant to be a complete severance of that relationship, unless that's what you're looking for,
Right.
but a way to keep those people close, but
Mm-hmm.
yourself and them maybe healthy,
Yeah.
and emotionally safe. But I think your experiences and your story is one that I feel many adults can relate to,
Mm-hmm.
that they had experiences of relational safety growing up, but as they got older and learned more and understood more, saw those limitations. And, I think about perhaps people who are maybe dealing with parents who maybe have, substance use issues, mental
Right.
health issues, that some of which is of their own choosing, some of which is not, some comes from other deeply rooted, experiences that they've had. But how then the adult child starts to understand that things weren't quite what I thought they
Yeah.
were, and or even, if we want to bring race into the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
growing up in areas that are extremely one way or the other.
Yeah,
And how then as an adult you start to see things differently, and how challenging maybe some of those beliefs from your childhood or your parents' beliefs or caregivers' beliefs or even close family members' beliefs can cause some of those ruptures, and how do we manage those?
absolutely. Yeah. And you spoke to it beautifully. That's the societal component of it. And that
Hmm.
is inherently linked to how we experience attachment.
Hmm. So if somebody was going to be if another adult was going through some of these situations, if they were
Mhm.
having some of these thoughts, what might be some guidance you would give them?
Mm,
Like, where would I start if I'm stuck and I'm trying to figure out how to set healthy boundaries? Like, what guidance or places to start?
right. And so the goal is staying in relationship with,
Yeah, yeah.
okay.
I feel like even in some of the most difficult situations, most people still want a relationship
Right.
if they can,
Absolutely.
as long as it's healthy, right?
Right. Because it's likely that this person, group of people, whatever the situation is, there's a reason you're connected to them, right?
Hmm.
And we naturally want to preserve that. And so the key to it is how are we able to go about that in a healthy way? And so what I'm looking into, which is largely framed in earned security and the ethics of care, is learning the methodology that we can do to stay in that without sacrificing our own needs. Will discomfort still arise? Absolutely. But it's about figuring out what our own personal boundaries are within that and figuring out what's a healthy amount of tolerance for all parties involved. So, what does this look like in reality? It's first of all practicing rupture and repair in safe relationships with those you feel comfortable doing so. That's a great way to introduce a lot of these concepts. So when it is time for that challenging conversation or moment with someone who you are figuring out what those boundaries look like, it makes it a lot easier to have those conversations because you have those fundamental pillars that you've been able to practice. It's starting to realize how to name your needs without shame and do so in a clear manner that doesn't falter. You are not wrong for having needs. You are not
Hmm.
wrong for expressing those needs and feeling secure enough to do so and to speak from that place, even when you know those needs might conflict with what you think the other person wants. It's about tolerating a level of closeness that you feel comfortable with without defensiveness or withdrawal. Because in those conversations, it is so easy to put up a wall, which, if that boundary needs to be put in place for your own psychological or physical safety, absolutely do so. But if it's a relationship in which you are figuring out those boundaries and navigating it and having those conversations, being awareness or bringing awareness to your own ability or hesitancy to slip into a period where you put up those walls and bringing awareness to that. And then finally, building that bodily capacity for connection through regulation and presence. There's an individual component to this. It's a slow accumulation of evidence. Our bodies are not naturally going to just slip into a state of, hey, I feel safe today, because one, that's not realistic. And two, physiologically and psychologically, that is not how it works. It is about understanding through built relational trust that I can still be seen, I can still be loved, I will still hurt, and we will still return. And that's a practice. That is a practice of care that we are continually working on each and every day. And that lived experience reshapes our internal worlds and our connections.
I almost don't want to say anything because I you just summed it up so perfectly, and I just love that we will return, we
Yeah.
will we can find a place of healing.
Yeah.
um I just love that so very much. And at the risk of making everything you said sound simple, it what you just described is how we create a secure attachment in the first place with
Correct.
our infants. I mean,
Yep.
it's exactly that, but we're doing it with adults and
Hmm.
with each other. And it's just, it always surprises me how, where does this get lost?
Yeah.
Where along the way do we stop doing that? And, and, and I mean, there's so many, I was going to say why, but there's so many different complexities to it, which of course I understand, which is why I said I don't want to make this sound simple because it's not. But sometimes I do wonder. I'm like, is this not common sense to
Right.
people to be able to create this for others? What go back to the old do unto others as you would yourself,
Hmm.
or I probably just messed that up, but oh, Aubrey, it has been wonderful chatting to you. I don't think that I can take this conversation anywhere else right now because I just want to be able to sit with what you have brought to us and our listeners. I think it's very, very powerful, very deep. And I think that the work that you're doing just sounds phenomenal. And I cannot wait to see what your research brings. And maybe when you get finished with it, then we can bring you back on and we can talk more about it.
I would love it. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure being here.
You are welcome. And hopefully, we'll have you on again soon.
Fantastic. I look forward to it.